I found him going through my mother's filing cabinet at 2 in the morning, and I told myself it was nothing. That's the part that still gets me. Not what he did later. Not the screaming in the driveway or the lawyers or the RCMP cruiser parked outside our house on a Tuesday afternoon. It's that moment, me standing in the hallway in my socks, watching him rifle through my mother's folders by the light of his phone, and choosing to go back to bed. I was 31 years old. I should have known better. Maybe I did know. That's the part I can't forgive myself for. My mother met my stepfather the autumn after my dad passed. She wasn't looking. She told me that herself, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she never drank, the week after the funeral. She said she was done with all of it. The compromise, the shared calendar, the negotiating over thermostat settings. She laughed when she said it, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that meant funny. His name was Douglas. He came into her life through her church's grief support group, which, in hindsight, tells you everything you need to know about how he operated. He had soft eyes and a way of tilting his head when he listened to you that made you feel like the most important person in the room. He'd lost his wife to cancer 3 years prior, he said. He understood grief. He understood loss. He understood her. They dated for 8 months. I met him 4 times before he moved in. I was living in Vancouver then, working for a property management company, and my mother was still in the house I grew up in, just outside of Guelph. She called me on a Sunday night in March to tell me Douglas had asked her to marry him. I remember standing on my apartment balcony in the rain, phone pressed to my ear, listening to her voice. She sounded like a teenager, giddy, breathless, like the world had cracked open and let something warm through. What was I supposed to say? I said I was happy for her. I said Douglas seemed like a good man. I said I'd book a flight home for Thanksgiving. I did not say, "Mom, you've known him for less than a year." I did not say, "He's already mentioned money 3 times in our 2 conversations." I did not say, "Something about the way he looks at your house makes me uncomfortable." I said what a good daughter says, and I went back inside and opened a bottle of wine and sat with my cat on the couch until midnight. They got married the following June. Small ceremony, just family and a few friends from church. Douglas wore a blue suit and cried during the vows, and half the room cried with him, and I stood there holding my small bouquet of wildflowers, smiling until my face hurt. By Christmas, he had his name on her bank accounts. He'd framed it practically, which was how he framed everything. He was the one home with her during the day, he pointed out. He was the one driving her to appointments, picking up groceries, managing the house. It only made sense for him to have access. My mother was 63 and in good health, and fully capable of managing her own finances. But Douglas had a way of making competence sound like a burden he was generously relieving you of. I heard about the bank accounts on Boxing Day when I came home for the holidays. My mother mentioned it the way you'd mention switching to a new brand of laundry detergent, casual, like it was already settled and not worth discussing. I asked if she'd talked to anyone about it. A financial advisor, her accountant, anyone. She looked at me the way she used to when I was 15 and questioning her parenting. "Douglas handles these things," she said. "That's what husbands do." Douglas was in the next room. I could hear him laughing at something on television. I flew back to Vancouver on December 27th and told myself it was fine, that I was projecting, that not every step-parent with access to a joint account was a predator, that I was being unfair to a man who had, by all visible evidence, made my mother happy. The thing about gaslighting yourself is that you're very good at it when you want to be. The calls from my mother started changing in February. Subtle at first, she'd sound tired when she answered, or she'd tell me she couldn't talk long because Douglas needed the phone. She'd started saying we for things she used to say I about. "We've decided to skip the church potluck this year. We don't really have people over anymore. We're trying to simplify." I asked her once if she was getting out much. She said Douglas preferred to keep things quiet at home. She said it in a tone that closed the subject. In April, she called me at 7 in the morning, which she never did, and I answered with my heart already in my throat. She said she was fine, she just wanted to hear my voice. I asked her 3 times if everything was okay. She said yes each time, and I believed her less each time, and then Douglas's voice came through the background, low, asking who she was talking to, and she said she had to go and hung up. I booked a flight home that afternoon. Work gave me 5 days. I told myself I was probably overreacting. When I got to the house, my mother looked thin. Not dramatic, not alarming on its own, but I knew her body the way you know your childhood home. I could feel where things had shifted. Her collarbone sat differently. The skin under her eyes was a color I didn't recognize. She hugged me at the door and held on a beat too long. Douglas was cordial. Made dinner, asked about my job, called me sweetheart in a way that felt like a lid being screwed on something. He talked a lot during the meal, filled every silence. My mother ate about half of what was on her plate and pushed the rest around. After he went to bed, I sat with her at the kitchen table, just us the way it used to be. I asked her how she was really doing. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said she'd been feeling off for a while, stomach issues, fatigue, some dizziness. She'd seen her doctor once, but the tests hadn't shown anything definitive. Douglas thought she was stressed, and that what she needed was rest and quiet. So she'd been resting and keeping things quiet. Have you gone back to the doctor? I asked. Douglas doesn't think it's necessary. I looked at my mother across the kitchen table in the house I grew up in, and I felt something cold move through me. Not panic, something quieter and more durable than panic. Something that said, pay attention. That was the night I found him at the filing cabinet. I'd woken up around 2, gone to get water, and there he was in the hallway, phone flashlight tilted into the cabinet drawer, the one my mother kept all her important papers in. Insurance documents, the deed to the house, her will. He looked up when he heard me, didn't startle. Just looked at me with those soft eyes and said he couldn't sleep and was looking for an old utility bill. I said okay. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark and I thought about the bank accounts, and my mother's weight, and the way she'd said, Douglas doesn't think it's necessary, and I thought about the utility bill excuse. And I lay there until 6 in the morning, cataloging every small thing I had explained away over the past year and a half. By the time the sky went gray outside my window, I had made a decision. I called in sick to work and stayed an extra 4 days without telling Douglas. When he went out, errands, a haircut, a long stretch on a Wednesday morning where he just disappeared for 3 hours, I went through what I could, not all of it. Enough. The mortgage on the house had been refinanced 6 months after the wedding. My mother's name was still on it, but the new terms were strange, a significantly higher loan amount than what would have been outstanding, with the additional funds disbursed to a bank account I didn't recognize. Her RRSP statements showed withdrawals I couldn't match to anything. Her credit card had a new authorized user, Douglas. I photographed everything on my phone, methodically. I tried to feel nothing and focus on the task, the way you do when you're in a situation that hasn't finished being terrible yet, and you can't afford to fall apart in the middle of it. I called my mother's family doctor's office from my car, parked 2 streets away. I explained who I was, and that I was concerned about my mother's health, and whether her symptoms might be related to something environmental or dietary. The receptionist was carefully neutral, and told me the doctor couldn't discuss her patient's file with me. I understood. I asked if there was a general number for public health nurses in the region, and she gave me one. I also called a lawyer. I found one through the Ontario Bar Association referral line, a family and estates lawyer in Guelph who had a cancellation slot that Thursday. I sat in her office with my phone full of photographs, and she listened without interrupting. She told me what I had was concerning but not yet conclusive. She told me the refinancing and the RRSP withdrawals could potentially have been authorized by my mother knowingly. She told me the most important thing right now was my mother's health, and that I needed to get her properly evaluated by a doctor, ideally without Douglas present. He accompanies her to appointments? She asked. I think so. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she gave me the name of a social worker at the hospital. Getting my mother to a doctor without Douglas was harder than it sounds. He had built himself into the architecture of her day so completely that I couldn't just suggest she go alone without him asking why, and if he asked why, she'd tell him because that's what my mother did. She told him things the way you tell things to someone you trust, the way she had once told them to me. I told her I had a checkup scheduled, and my own Ontario health card wasn't coming up in the system, and could she come with me for moral support? It was a bad lie, but she didn't question it because I was her daughter, and she still lived in the version of the world where her daughter didn't need to lie to her. We were in the waiting room when she started crying, quietly, with her hands folded in her lap, looking at nothing. I put my arm around her and she leaned into me and said she didn't know why she was so tired all the time, and she didn't want to be a burden and she was sorry. You are not a burden, I said. You are my mother. You are not a burden. I asked the triage nurse if there was any chance we could speak to a doctor together. Since my mother had been experiencing symptoms for several months, and I had some concerns. I said it as calmly as I could, and I held my mother's hand while I said it. They took us into a room. I told the doctor what I'd observed, the weight loss, the fatigue, the stomach issues, the dizziness. The doctor ordered blood work. Thorough blood work, the kind that covers a wide panel. My mother sat on the exam table with her paper gown crinkling when she shifted, and I sat in the chair beside her and held her hand some more. We were home before Douglas got back from wherever he'd been. The results took 11 days. 11 days of me back in Vancouver, checking my phone every 20 minutes, calling my mother every evening, and listening for things in her voice. Douglas was always there, in the background, a presence I could feel through the phone like a low-frequency hum. The doctor called my mother directly. I found out about it through a call from the social worker the hospital had looped in. Apparently my mother, after speaking to her doctor, had reached out to the social worker herself. The blood work had shown elevated levels consistent with heavy metal toxicity. Not conclusive on its own, but enough to warrant further testing, enough to warrant concern. The social worker asked if my mother had a safe place to go. I was on a plane the next morning. What happened after that moved both faster and slower than I can accurately describe. My mother left the house while Douglas was at his Thursday morning coffee group. He called it a coffee group. I later learned it was a rotating gathering he used primarily to meet new women. But that's a different chapter of the story. She packed one bag. I had booked her into a hotel room 2 towns over, paid a different name on the booking, because I wasn't sure what Douglas had access to and I wasn't taking chances. She cried the whole drive there, not dramatically, just steadily like a slow leak. She said she felt foolish. I told her she was not foolish. She said she should have seen it sooner. I told her that's what people like Douglas count on, that you won't see it because they're very careful about what they let you see. We sat in the hotel room eating takeout pho from a place nearby, and she looked at me across the little table and said, "When did you know?" I thought about the filing cabinet at 2 in the morning. I thought about Boxing Day. I thought about standing on my balcony in the Vancouver rain listening to her sound like a teenager. "I suspected for a while," I said. "I'm sorry it took me this long to do something about it." She shook her head. "You did exactly what you needed to do." Douglas came home to an empty house and called her 12 times in the first hour. She didn't answer. The 13th call, she answered with me sitting beside her and the social worker on speakerphone. And she told him she was safe, she was not coming home, and he should speak to her lawyer. He told her she was confused. He told her she'd been unwell and wasn't thinking clearly. He told her everything they'd built together was at risk because of her daughter. "My daughter," he said, like I was something that had happened to her, filling her head with nonsense. She said, "Goodbye, Douglas," and ended the call. I want to tell you that was the moment everything resolved itself neatly. It wasn't. What followed was 4 months of legal proceedings, a police report filed with the Ontario Provincial Police, an investigation that eventually involved financial crimes, and a civil matter around the refinanced mortgage that cost my mother money she didn't have on a lawyer, and cost her more in the kind of tired that doesn't show up on blood work. The heavy metal testing came back positive for arsenic, at levels that weren't immediately dangerous, but were consistent with long-term low-dose exposure. The toxicologist who reviewed the results said it wouldn't have been dramatic. It would have looked like a slow decline. Fatigue, stomach issues, confusion, easy to attribute to age or stress, easy to miss. When I think about what would have happened if I hadn't come home that April, I have to put the thought down and walk away from it. The investigation eventually connected Douglas to 2 previous marriages, one in Alberta and one in New Brunswick. In Alberta, his ex-wife's family had raised concerns after her death about financial irregularities, but nothing had been pursued formally. In New Brunswick, his ex-wife was still alive and had taken a significant financial loss in the separation, but hadn't filed criminal charges because she said she just wanted to be done with him. She agreed to speak to the investigators. She called my mother when they were through, which I know because my mother told me about it, the way it happened to her, the things she recognized. She said it was like reading her own diary in a stranger's handwriting. Douglas was charged with fraud over $5,000, a criminal code offense in Canada, as well as 1 count of administering a noxious substance. The arsenic charge, which the Crown pursued based on the toxicology and a chemical compound found in the garage of the Guelph house that Douglas, significantly, could not explain. He hired a private lawyer on what we later learned were my mother's remaining RRSP funds, which added a particular kind of bitterness to the proceedings. He was convicted on both counts. The fraud conviction carried a sentence of 3 years. The noxious substance charge added 18 months to be served consecutively. His lawyer appealed. The appeal was denied. My mother sold the Guelph house after it all settled. She said she couldn't be in it anymore, and I understood that, the same way I understood why she started going back to church, 2 Sundays a month, and stopped going to the grief support group. Some rooms you can't re-enter, some doors you close, and that's that. She moved into a condo in Hamilton, near her sister, 10 minutes from a good farmer's market she goes to on Saturday mornings. I visited last spring and she made dinner from scratch, and we ate at her table with her cat on the chair between us. And she laughed at something I said, and the sound of it didn't have anything hiding underneath it. She looked like herself. It took me a moment to realize I hadn't seen her look like herself in years. I still live in Vancouver. I call her more than I used to. I have her set up with a fee-only financial advisor, someone who works only for clients, takes no commissions, has no interest in anything except my mother's financial well-being. It took some convincing. She said she didn't want to be a bother. I said she wasn't a bother. That conversation goes the same way every time, and I expect it will for a while yet. The social worker who helped us through the early part of all this told me something I've thought about a lot since. She said the women who survive these situations and come out the other side are almost never the ones who acted on the first instinct. They're the ones who stayed quiet long enough to get their facts straight, who didn't tip their hand before they had the documentation, who prioritized safety over confrontation. She said it looks like passivity from the outside, but it isn't. It's strategy, and strategy is what actually wins. I think about the night at the filing cabinet. I think about the girl who went back to bed. Maybe she wasn't weak. Maybe she was buying time, even if she didn't know it yet. I don't know if I believe that, but it's what I tell myself on nights when I'm still a little ashamed of how long it took me to act. What I do know is this: I came home. Maybe later than I should have, but I came home, and she was still there. And we still had time. That has to count for something. I'm still deciding how much.